Good afternoon. Welcome to the August 2023 Leadership Lunch and Learn book review series. We are so glad you joined us for lunch. The food for thought is on us. I'm Lisa Davis, Leadership Program Associate in the Community Professional and Economic Development Unit, otherwise known as CPED, at the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture. We have a great book review on the menu today. One quote from the book, Leaders Eat Last, Why Some Teams Pull Together and Others Don't, by Sinek says, "Let us all be the leaders we wish we had." Our book reviewer today, my colleague, Dr. Hunter Goodman, will share insights from the book. Hunter is the Assistant Professor for Community, Workforce, and Economic Development in CPED. Hunter focuses on building capacity across Arkansas, particularly in the areas of nonprofit, workforce, and community leadership for local development and resiliency. Hunter, the kitchen is yours.
Thank you, Lisa and Rita, and thank you to my colleague, Dr. Julie Robinson, for the kind invitation to be a part of today. So let's get started. I am super excited about this book. For anyone who knows me or has been around me for more than an hour, you know that I love Simon Sinek. So the chance to have an opportunity to review his book was terrific. So this is the book, Simon Sinek, Leaders Eat Last, as Lisa just said. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the screen so that you can see it. And so we're going to just do this real quick. We're going to get this set up and we're going to go. So in terms of next steps, I want to tell you kind of how we're going to flow this. So first of all, we're going to do a little bit of a check-in question. We're going to hear from the author because I am not Simon Sinek, but he is fabulous. And so you will be a lot better off if you hear from him, rather than a full 45 minutes or 40 minutes of me. Then we'll talk a little bit, we'll have some key points from the book and do chat discussion, key points, discussion, and then application and next steps. So that's kind of how it's going to roll. And I'm asking you to really be your whole self here. So this is not just about professional, it's really everything that you are: professional, personal, neighborhood, neighborhood and community member, son, daughter, wife, husband, aunt, uncle, etc. You know, your whole self. So to start off with, I want you to just put in the chat, when you think of the words leaders eat last, what words come to mind? And I'm not looking for paragraphs here, like words, the things that are you're specifically like, you hear that and you go, oh, that means this.
Okay, Hunter, I'm seeing patience, serving others first. They put their team first. Servant leadership. Humble. Selfless. And putting others first are those that are popping up.
Outstanding. So keep those coming, because that's really kind of you're right there. Don't know if you've already read the book. Some of you probably already have. Some of you haven't. That's okay. We'll try to today, if you haven't read the book, no stress. We'll give you all the things you need and hopefully entice you to read it. If you have read the book, I would love to, let's keep the conversation going, because I'd love to hear more from you. So I want to start off with just him. So we're going to hear from Simon Sinek around why he named he gave the book the title that he did. It's 4 minutes, but it really is the whole, it kind of builds. So I couldn't pick out just one little piece. I had to do the whole thing. So bear with me. I think you'll love it because he represents himself best.
There's a funny story that goes along with how we came up with the title of this book, and we are all to blame. Here I am writing a book about the importance of working with people, interacting with people, human relationships, and yet the way I and the publisher interacted was we would send emails to each other with title suggestions. Every now and then we'd get on the phone, but it was mainly done through email. Somebody would send a list of their favorite, and somebody would write back, "That's junk, I kind of like that one." And it was a labored, horrible process. We never agreed. It was just talking at each other. And coincidence, I happened to be walking past the publisher's office and decided to stick my head in and say hello, went upstairs, and we sat down, and within, I think, 30 or 40 minutes, we had a title that we all fell in love with. And what you realize is we can tell an idea to someone over email, but you can't interact. And if you think about how ideas really happen, it's not presentation, response. It's interruption and backwards and forwards and battling and saying, no, that's not what I mean. And it's messy. And it's the messiness that cannot happen over an internet connection, over email, because everything is exact over email. It can happen over the phone, but it's so much better in person when you get to see someone's body language and you see the frustration and you try and re-explain yourself. And we told each other stories as opposed to telling each other what we think it should be. And the story that I told was not being able to understand what made the Marines so amazing at what they do. I sat down with a Marine Corps general, General Flynn actually, who wrote the foreword for the book. And I said to him, what makes the Marines so great? And he looked at me and said, officers eat last. And it sort of struck me that if you compare that to the business world and the entrepreneurial world, entrepreneurs are always told, pay yourself first, look after yourself first. And yet, I'm being told by this Marine general that it's the complete opposite. And there's a symbolic gesture, but more importantly, there's an importance to it. There's a photograph I saw, in these Kenya shootings that happened not so long ago. We had the amazing experience that a photographer happened to be in the building. Usually we see the aftermath, and here we now have photographs of the actual shooting going on. And there's one photograph that was in the New York Times that both haunted me and inspired me to this day. It haunted me and inspires me, I should say. And it's the photograph of a mother, in the sound of gunshots, lays herself on top of her child. And you see this picture of a mother lying on top of her child, and you realize that's what it is. That's what leadership is. That when there is danger, it's not protecting myself, but it's rather willing to put myself in harm's way to protect another. That's what eating last means. It means that I will give the very essence of life, food and water, I will give it to the person I love first, so that they may live, even if it means I eat less. And that's what officers eat last means. It is symbolic, but it is also very real. And real leadership, real leaders, I've even given up the terminology of good leaders and great leaders. You're either a leader or you're not a leader. That's it. Real leaders, biological, anthropological leaders, are that mother who instinctively, without weighing the pros and cons or the bad things that may happen to her, throw herself on her child. That's what leadership is. Do we believe that our leaders would throw themselves on us, if they heard gunshots? If the economy shook, would they quickly throw themselves on us? That's what leaders eat last means. It is very literal. It is very, very literal.
Okay. So he can tell his own story so much better than I can. And if you've read any Simon Sinek books, you know that he always starts with a story. And that story runs throughout the entire book. So I'm going to do my best to set the framework for the book that he has in the very beginning and then he has in the very end, because I think it's important. And he starts out by telling the story of a pilot that goes by the call sign of Johnny Bravo. And Johnny Bravo is they're in a battle, and his men are on the ground. He is up above the cloud cover, and there's nothing that was said over the airwaves to tell him danger or alert or we need help. There was nothing like that. But the tone of his men told him that there was something wrong. And it was extremely dangerous for him to come below the cloud cover in that moment. But he did it anyway because it was the difference of 22 lives. And so he came down the cloud cover, and sure enough, his men were in an all-out battle. They were outmanned and outgunned. And so he began firing. But because of where he was, if he fired at a certain way, the bullets would ricochet and hit his men. And so he calculated quickly in such a way that he could fire at a certain point and not hit his men. But he had to do that based on certain counts and calculations, and keeping to that. It was that thin of a margin. And he took shots, and he would go to the point where he wouldn't hit a mountain, and he would come up, he'd go through the cloud cover, he'd come back. And he did that repeatedly until he ran out of bullets. And he went up and he got his fellow aircraft, his colleague, let him know what was going on. And together they went back down through the cloud cover, and side by side with Johnny Bravo doing the counting and the colleague doing the shooting, they saved those 22 men. Not a single man died that day from American troops. And Sinek starts the book that way. Again, if you know his books, that's customary of the way he does things. But that story of Johnny Bravo is a theme throughout the entire book. And so if we think about the book, there's really a couple of key words and phrases that are important to keep in mind. The first is the ultimate leadership lesson is empathy. It's truly understanding where other people are coming from and meeting them where they are. And he talks about a circle of safety, and then in our organizations, he talks about it in the context of the military, but he draws that out in ways that we think about our organizations too. That if we think about a space and a place where we spend so much of our time in our day in organizations, if we feel like others around us, we trust them, they have our back, so to speak, they believe in us, and that they will do anything to help and support us in our shared mission, that's a circle of safety. Again, coming out of the military context, but he applies that in the business, entrepreneurial, and organizational context. And he says that when the circle of safety is strong, we naturally share ideas, we share intelligence, and we share the burdens of stress. And he notes that it's not just the followers. He doesn't call them followers, that's my word, but that the people that are in an organization want to feel safe, but so do the leaders, that it goes both ways. And there are parts of the book where he goes on to explain that when that circle of safety is weak, we naturally as humans distrust, we do not share our intelligence, and we carry greater burdens of stress. So he's really very much the theme throughout the entire book is that circle of safety, that ability to have empathy, and the relationships and human connections, which he drew out there in the video, are currently key, are really, really strong parts of this book. So there's a key early on in the book. He talks about the awesome responsibility, and the way the awesome responsibility kind of comes to fruition is through a story of a leader who stepped in to a leader of a company where there was extreme distrust, there was low productivity, and he tried to understand why. And he realized that there was a lack of fairness, that some in the organizations, the executives were treated a certain way. The people in the warehouse floor were treated a different way. The people on the warehouse floor had to wait for a bell to take a break and go to the bathroom or take a phone call, whereas people in the executive suite could go and do that as they please, take care of their families, do what they needed. And that created an inequity that was a problem. And it was creating problems within that company. And so the gentleman who is this executive is sitting at a wedding, and he's watching two of his good friends get married. And he's sitting in the pew and he says, "I've got it, I understand." And he says, every single employee is someone's son or someone's daughter. Like a parent, a leader of a company is responsible for those precious lives. And so Sinek goes on to say in that section that being a leader is like being a parent, and the company or the organization is like a new family to join. One that will take care of us like we are their own, in sickness and in health. And if we are successful, our people will take on our company's name as a sign of the family to which we are loyal. So let me just stop there. That's a lot. We've only had like 4 slides. That's a lot, right? So any before I go to this next one, if you want to put anything in the chat or queue up any questions, we're going to take a chat break here in just a minute. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about EDSO. So there's Sinek is very, and if you've read some of his other books, this is true to his form. He talks about the chemicals in our body, and he's very anthropological in his approach to leadership. And he goes back to the very root of who we are as people. And that goes back to our survival and how we evolved. And he says that there are 4 chemicals that are a part of who we are, and they're part of what has evolved in humans for us to survive as a species. And he think all the way back to the cavemen and women and how they would survive and fight for their own food. And so in that context, he says that there are 4 key things. One is E is for endorphins, and he talks about that as the runner's high, and that's the things that we get when we get that surge in us. We do something, it's like, woo! That's the endorphins piece. The second is the D is for dopamine, and that's really the part of us that is moved and driven by an incentive or a need for progress. So that we as a human species need that ability to have clear goals. And at the very base level, we are visually oriented creatures. The third one is S is for serotonin, and that's the leadership chemical. And that's that piece that he talks about is really that sense of pride. So it doesn't have to be that we're at the top of something to be the leader. He shares a story. If you watch a young man or woman walk across the stage at graduation, they have incredible pride surging through them for what they've accomplished for this degree. But it's not just them that have that pride. They look in the audience and they see their parents, and it's a shared sense of pride and joy in the accomplishment. And so there, if you think about that in the organizational context, that's important as well. And then the O is for oxytocin. And that's the chemical love. And it's really, in this sense, it's trust and respect. So he says that if we have, and going back to the circle of safety thing, right? So if we trust and respect each other, we have that circle of safety. So the EDSO, these 4, are what he says are core parts of leadership. And that we in organizations, and in whatever context we're in community with others, that these 4 things drive us. They're core to who we are as human beings, and that they help move us forward in positive ways. I will say that there's another one that's not in this section, but it's later in the book, called cortisol, and that is the stress hormone, and that releases when someone is in stress. So you want to be in a situation where you don't have as much of the cortisol, you have the EDSO. So he argues that when we have situations of stress and anxiety, it releases in us a sense of defensiveness and all sorts of things that are not good for us and not good for our health. So health and well-being. All right. So now you've got the queue up for the questions. And specifically, I'd like to just take a minute and in the chat, what key questions or points are coming up for you as we talk through the slides and concepts? And even if it's just, I have a question, that's fine. Put that in the chat and let's just take a minute to debrief. So Lisa's going to read those for me as they come up. If there's a burning question, something we want to see and talk about.
Nothing's coming in so far, but you mentioned trust is a key component. So maybe we could talk about how you build trust amongst your team or family.
What a beautiful pass to the next question, Lisa. I think one of the things about the way he says that is, so that's a nice base hit in our baseball analogies to take us to where the slides to come. But I'll say that really he says that building trust is about being present with people, keeping relationships at the center, and never losing track of the people in spite of the numbers. And that he recognizes that in organizations, it's important. You have to have, success, bottom line, all of that sort of thing. But that he says that it has to come first and foremost in the grounding of people. And going back to the Chapman example, that's the one with the company that had the aha moment at the wedding. He, after he heard from employees and gave them a safe space to really tell him what was going on, he guaranteed he wouldn't fire anybody for what they said. And when he gave them that space, he learned that there were pay phones on the warehouse floor, and that if an employee wanted to make a call, they had to pay for that, whereas employees had free access in the company suite to whatever phone. And so immediately he, the next day, had all of those pay phones taken out. He took all the locks off of the areas that had supplies, which were had padlocks on them. He took all that off. He got rid of the pay phones, put in company phones, and those small actions changed the culture. And so that trust is part of the actions that a leader takes on whatever level, wherever they are in an organization, that really show that there is an equal level of trust, both for them and their teammates, but for the teammates for them, that it's a two-way street.
Here are a few comments that relate to family. Someone said they've never thought of responsibility for others' lives as part of leadership. The family concept is really hitting home. And the question is, does this ring true in families too? How do we apply these principles personally and professionally? All employees need to watch this webinar. Agreed. It would be nice to have my manager watching this. Laughing out loud. There you go.
Well, this is being recorded, so you're welcome to tell other people about it. Those are terrific points. And I think absolutely, I know for me, on a personal note, I have been doing a lot of traveling this summer, and some of it to family. I've had some family illness. And so I was actually listening to this at many points when I was driving to see family. And so I think for me, it has double resonance in not only an organizational context, but in a life context. And to the person who said that, absolutely, I mean, spot on, right? As parents and as who we are, that's why I put that slide in the beginning about bring your whole self here, because these are principles that apply no matter what. And it's something that everybody can relate to. So keep those coming. Lisa's going to keep watching, and Lisa, please stop me as things come in if there's something we need to stop and grab. So I'm going to go to the next one. And I would say that, he really talks in the next section of the book about our growth over time. So keeping in mind that Sinek is very much goes to sort of anthropological roots of going back to our very beginnings as cavemen and women. And then he starts talking about World War II and the baby boom generation, and about how we as a society, he traces from our very beginnings to present day, all the different aspects of kind of who we've become. And he talked about how studies exist, and he describes several of them including the Milgram studies and others, on how we act when we are distanced from a situation. So I want to tell two stories that he tells. Again, I'm going to do my best to pull out my inner Simon Sinek here. So first one is, he says, there's a war-torn area in Syria. Think about Syria. There's people dying every day. There are he tells a story about a particular point in time when a chemical bomb was launched on the people by the leadership there. And families, innocent civilians died. It was horrific. There's also a young woman lying dead in the street, or rather lying injured in the street. She's clearly, something has happened. She's been hit by a car. Her leg is not in the position where a normal leg should be. A young Army lieutenant walks up, sits beside her, and begins giving CPR and doing everything she possibly can to save her life. Nearby bystanders walk up, call emergency, they get an ambulance, they take her to the hospital. A week later, the young lieutenant goes to try to figure out what's going on or what happened to the young woman, and learns that she has passed away. She did not make it. So when you hear those two stories, which one of those makes you feel connected and called to do something? And you can put that in the chat if you like. If you feel comfortable, you don't have to. Generally speaking, it's the second story, right? It's the fact that not that we don't feel incredibly called to support, and we feel incredible empathy and pain and sadness for the situation in Syria. But what does the average person do? Whereas you see someone lying in the street, we're more likely to do what that young lieutenant did, or what the bystander who called the ambulance, because it's right there in front of us. And so he uses that just as an example of how we are, if it's right there, if it is in front of us and it is not distanced, and it's not a number, it's not a percentage, it's not, you know, that story, but it's our story, or it's a story we can relate to right in front of us, we are much more likely to be connected and step out in that way. So he gives 5 rules, what kind of ways as we think about leaders. So we're getting into the section where these are going to be 5 rules, and then preview of coming attractions, we're going to talk about leadership rules. So hang in there. We got 5 and 5, or 5 and 4, or whatever. Here, coming soon. So the first is the rules to addressing abstraction. So in particular, he's talking about here the fact that we can feel very distanced from situations because of our society, a variety of reasons for that, if you think about our history. But he says there are 5 rules to addressing abstraction. And the first one is to keep it real and always bring people together. Keep a core concentration on connecting people, because that's at the core of how we make sure that we don't become numbers or percentages. Secondly, he talks about keeping it manageable. And he uses an example in the book about, he calls it the 150 rule. And it's a manager who walks into a situation and realizes that when it grows beyond 150 people, people start to feel distanced, or they feel like they're not connected to one another. But when it's in a group of 150, or a factory 150, or an organization of 150, even if it's more than 150, but they're grouped in 150s, that there tends to be more connection. So he talks about that. He also says it's really important to meet the people you serve or help. So there's not an abstraction, it's not a number. And he gives an example in the book of around giving them time, or not just money. If you are moving and you realize very quickly you're going to have to move to a new home, 2 friends of yours, one gives you a donation for the moving services, the other one comes and spends the day packing your boxes and moving you. A week later, both friends need a favor. Which one are you going to act on first? The one who gave you the time, or the one who wrote you the check? He goes to human basis there. And then number 5 is be patient. And so he tells the story at this point about meeting someone and finding out they spend a great day together. They have a wonderful conversation. They have all this time, and they realize they want to get married. You're like, really? Like, do you really know that person? Whereas a couple's together for 7 years, they haven't gotten married. Someone might say, well, why not? He uses that as an example of, you can't have all the answers in one day, but you can't always wait 7 years. So it's about that, finding the flux between how to really address abstraction. So the next one is, here we go, leadership lessons. In the whole book, he really talks about, I mean, there's lots in this book, but one of the leadership lessons is, so goes the culture, so goes the company. So he stresses very much that bad cultures breed bad leaders, but that a culture that allows creation and innovation really builds tremendous power and leadership. He talks about the Post-it note, and the fact the Post-it note was actually an accident. Somebody didn't mean to create, and they put it out for the company at large, and someone else took that idea, created the Post-it note, and here we go. That's a culture of innovation, right? Versus you can't use that, you know, let's put that away somewhere, that's never to be seen again. It creates a different way of thinking. The second one is, so goes the leader, so goes the culture. So it's very much about, he gives examples and scenes from the book around cult leaders who come in and make it about I rather than about we. And even the strongest companies and organizations lose their culture when they lose the focus on we. The third piece is that friends matter. And is it our role to win or to serve? And so he's going back there to this really, when he actually uses an example in here about our political division and how at a time when we were not so divided and refused to talk to one another, but rather to work even across the aisle, that created more of a collaborative environment. However you feel about politics, that's the example he gave. And then the fourth, the next one is lead the people and not the numbers. And so he really focused on values of leaders shape the organizations, and that is empathy leads as a core value of a leader, so builds the organization. Okay, so in the spirit of time, I'm going to make this one quick. I would just, because I know there's a lot there with the leadership lessons, I'd love for you to make comments in the chat. Again, Lisa, please articulate anything that's coming up. And I'm just wondering if there was a particular one of those leadership lessons that stands out for you.
I would say the leading with empathy, that stands out to me. I haven't seen any other posts yet.
No worries.
Serving instead of winning is one.
Mm-hmm. Outstanding. So keep those coming and interrupt me, Lisa, as we go forward.
Someone says time instead of money.
Absolutely.
And friends matter. So goes the leader, so goes the culture.
Absolutely. Key points. So I want to talk a little bit about shared dangers. He does talk a lot, and again, if you've read Sinek in other ways, this is not a new theme. And that is, he talks a lot about generations, but he really talks a lot about generations in this book. And preview of coming attractions, he has a section on millennials, which we'll touch on at the end of the presentation. But he talks about some of the dangers to leadership and to this really focus on relationships and people-centered leadership, which I think is the core of where this book is centered. And that is that when we live in a purely digital space with distractions, that, you know, he talks about our cell phones, and we may be doing something 1 minute, we get a buzz or a beep and we turn and we do something else and we come back. He talks about that as something being really problematic when you're trying to focus and build on relationships and truly understand where other people are coming from, and that you cannot do that when you're moving back and forth. And he talks about that a lot in the book. He also talks about less emphasis on relationships, and that relationships are key to our survival and our sense of fulfillment. And again, that addiction to our devices thing comes up. Did I tell you that was a lot? It's a lot in the book. So that digital space piece is, and the communication and how we get back to people and understanding people and where people are coming from. So I want to leave you, as we kind of transition, I want you to take a look at this quote. Leadership is not a license to do less. It is a responsibility to do more. And that's the trouble. Leadership takes work. It takes time and energy. The effects are not always easily measured, and they are not always immediate. Leadership is always a commitment to human beings. Let me let that sink in for a second. That's absolutely, I think, the core message here of his overall, as he goes through the book. And if you're reading the book, we're kind of cruising towards the end here. He also has a section of the millennial generation, and there's to the person in the audience who talked about families, you know, absolutely. He has a section here in the end of the book. Even if you just want to scan and go to the end, I think it's really helpful. That talks about not only for companies, which I'm going to highlight just because this is for an organization, but also for millennials and for their parents, of how to really support the millennial generation. As he does put a lot of emphasis on generations, but he really comes back in the very end to put an emphasis point on the millennial generation. and the uniqueness they bring to organizations. And so he says for a company to truly uplift the gifts of its millennials, one thing is to reduce distractions and cell phones, take them out of conference rooms. Because millennial generation, but I think it's probably true of me too, that right, we get the, going back to the EDSO thing where we get a little burst from our phone if you've got mail or you've got a text, and we want to look at it because it's instant gratification. We can't help ourselves. So that reducing distractions and cell phones. No, mine's right in front of me, right? It's my timekeeper. So it's like reduce distractions and cell phones. The second one is to encourage note taking rather than computer notes, because we just are ingrained more to learn when we actually take the notes ourselves. Or an electronic device you take, like you literally write. The third is to teach leadership. He said that we can't assume that everyone knows what leadership is. It's not just something you wake up one day and say, ah, I've arrived. And then to teach how to give and receive feedback, because though that may be natural to some of us, it's not necessarily natural to the millennial generation. So it's really important to teach how to give and receive feedback. And then he talks about, which is great, about how to really take advantage of the gifts of the millennials on your team. And he talks about the fact that as an overall, and granted, when you talk about a generation, it's not a one size fits all paintbrush, right? But he does talk about the fact that the generation has comfort with change, and they're much easier to pivot than some other generations. And they also have the ability to sell and tell the story in incredible ways, where on the back end, more experienced employees can build the relationships, whereas more experienced employees have more experience in that, but also building relationships, given that our millennial generation has had phones and electronics, text and chat and all that good stuff. It's harder for them to build relationships in the way that some older generations expect us all to. So with that, I'd like to, we've got just a few minutes left. We got about 8 minutes. I want you to take 2 minutes and take out a piece of paper wherever you are. And I want you to just jot down the leadership lesson that you will take from this session. So I'm going to be quiet for a minute and just give you a chance to jot down a couple of the leadership lessons that really jump out for you out of this presentation. Okay, so keep talking, keep writing rather. And I want you to just see the reference here on the screen. I do want you to go back and take that sheet of paper that you just jotted down, put it somewhere, and next week, this time, or whenever it's convenient for you, go back and look at it. I know one of the things for me is I have thoughts today, but those thoughts continue to percolate in the days to come. So I would encourage you to go back and look at your notes next week and see where that takes you. And so that brings us to the close. I would like to open up. If there are any questions, please put those in the chat and let us know those questions and those ideas. Would love to take those at this point. Now, Lisa, we have just maybe a little bit of time, a minute or two.
Yeah, a few minutes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So based on the book, what characteristics, if you look at the quote, let us all be leaders we wish we had, what characteristics kind of stuck out to you, leadership characteristics that you hope to exhibit or wish your leaders exhibited as well?
I think empathy was a core theme of this book. And really that, going back to that quote that was in the very beginning of the presentation around the marriage, and that thinking of the people that we work with, the people that work with us, that we're entering into a relationship and that we're taking care of each other. And I think that is definitely a core theme. I think also really thinking about building trust and that not losing track of the numbers and the data versus the people. I mean, I'm a PhD, I can't help myself. I'm data and numbers and stories and all that good stuff, but it's always about the people and staying centered and grounded with the people that you work alongside. And I think the other thing that really jumped out at me was some of those aspects of culture, which are clear in this book. He comes back to culture again and again, and that the culture is driven by the people and on all levels.
We have another question. Are there any examples of how an employee can help provide a, quote, safe place for the leaders?
Absolutely. So he talks about going back to that example I gave in the very beginning of Mr. Chapman, who stepped into the company where he asked employees to come and tell him what was really happening in the company. And one of the employees that stepped up, he said, am I going to have a job tomorrow? And Mr. Chapman said, absolutely. And if you don't, you call me. That's for the employee. But when Mr. Chapman did what he said he would do, and he made those changes, those same employees made sure he had protection, because he was making some really radical changes that the people in the executive suite did not like. And so it's that space and place, I think, wherever you are in the organization, as you provide feedback and changes and things that you want to see that make that safe space for you as an employee, hold true to that. Because the leader, when they go out and do those things, they have to know that then they come back to that it's all a circle, right? And that it's not just about going out on a limb and then having that limb break. It's about working together and truly being on the branches of a tree in a circular form where employees and leaders and executives and all support each other. And that leads to that productive culture of a safe, trustful space.
Well, thank you, Hunter. That we appreciate your review of Leaders Eat Last. And I know you're going to go eat lunch later as the leader that you are. Everyone, we hope you enjoyed the free food for thought during this webinar.